Our guest today is as legendary as the Formula One champions he has chronicled for over 40 years. It is an honor to be joined by award-winning motorsport journalist Maurice Hamilton. Maurice, how's it going in the UK? I really appreciate you joining us today.
It's my pleasure, Bobby. It's great to be here. We've got perfect day here in England, perfect weather. So the window's open, the heat's coming in, the summer's in full bloom, and we're talking about the Grand Prix season's about to get restarted in a couple of weeks. It's all looking good.
All great news, and you also have a great book that you've just put out. The title of the book is Niki Lauda, the biography. I wanted to have you on to discuss this book because, in my opinion, you are a self-made man. You've always talked about getting into this business and actually trying to start from the bottom up, that you talked your way into this business. And I think Niki Lauda is someone that kind of talked his way into the business of Formula One.
That's correct. There's a lot of similarities, actually, because he had a very tough upbringing in respect of getting into racing. His parents were dead against it. Nobody in the family approved of it. He came from quite a wealthy background, and his grandfather in particular had it marked out for Niki to take over the very prosperous print paper business that they had. And when the grandson, Niki, went off to go motor racing, the grandfather just didn't approve, didn't like that, and actually blocked Niki from borrowing money from a bank to go racing. It was that bad. And it actually got to the point where Niki wouldn't speak to his grandfather. He just fell out with him over this. And in fact, sadly, he never spoke to him again because one of Niki's great regrets was that his grandfather died before Niki, won his first championship in 1975. So he would have liked to have said to him in a nice way, "Look, Granddad, this is what I want to do. This is why I wanted to do it. Look what I've achieved." And he would have felt that the grandfather would have approved. But yes, it was a very tough start for him. And yeah, we've got a lot of similarities because I came in not knowing anybody and just had to claw my way up. So same thing, yeah.
Now, you ended up meeting Lauda in 1971, but your first Grand Prix as a professional journalist is the South African Grand Prix in 1977, which is actually a big one for Niki Lauda because that's his first victory after the big accident in 1976. What was that first experience like for you and actually getting to interview him? Because I know that he gave you a little bit of a hard time.
It was my first race, as you rightly say, and it was really a race of mixed emotions. Because very sadly, a young British driver called Tom Price was killed in that race. So it's my first race as a professional. And I actually see the accident, unfortunately, because I was out on the track at the time. In those days, there was no TV coverage. You weren't in a media center. You had to go out on the track. So I saw all that. But then I saw Lauda's first win since his comeback. And it was a very emotional win for him. When I talked to him many years later about it, he said actually it was a win that was very important to him, because he'd had the accident the previous year in 76. He'd come back from that, just lost the championship by 1 point, and this was a first victory, which meant a lot. It said to him, yeah, I can do it. This is how to do it. And of course, he went on then to win the championship. So it meant a lot to him in 77. And also, by the way, that particular win in South Africa, it was typical Lauda in that he had to nurse the car across the line, because the accident I referred to earlier, a lot of debris from that was still on the track. Now, today they would stop the race if something like that happened, but in those days they didn't. And he carried on, and part of the debris punctured the radiator of the Ferrari. He didn't know this, but he did know that the warning lights were coming on, that it was running out of oil, the temperature was going up, and he had to nurse the car across the line, and he just crossed the line and it blew up. So again, even more emotion attached to that win. But you referred to giving me a hard time. I think that's referring to the very first interview I did in Detroit in 82. Between practice sessions, right, in the pit lane in Detroit. So you can imagine all the chaos and the noise going on. And he just got out of the car, he talked to his engineer, and I was introduced to him, hopefully to make an appointment for later. And he said, okay, yep, start now. And I had to immediately, and luckily I've been warned this might happen. So I had my tape recorder and I had the questions in my head, and I was able to do it because he was putting you to the test to see how good you were. And if he felt that you were good at doing your job, you would get all the answers you wanted. If he didn't, you would get very poor answers and you might even walk away. So I passed the first test, Bobby. It was all right.
I think a lot of the fans here in the U.S. probably learned about him if they weren't into Formula One driving. I think Rush is a terrific film. I know that he was interviewed and said that it's about 80% correct. And initially when he watched the movie, he had said that it was something that he didn't think was all that good. He actually thought he came across kind of in an arrogant, negative way. But ultimately, when he finally saw the film all cut together with music and the reception that it received, he was really happy, pleased with the film.
As you rightly say, Bobby, he saw the first uncut version and he didn't particularly like it. But as he said, 80% was correct. And he said there was 20% Hollywood, which he said was fine, because you have to do that to make the movie work. And by that he meant things like the calendar that they raced to in the film wasn't quite correct. There was lots of little details that people like me would see, but it didn't matter, because in essence, the film brought across the character of James Hunt and Niki Lauda perfectly. Daniel Bruhl, who played Lauda, was fantastic. I mean, you talk about me doing his accent. Bruhl was brilliant, just really encapsulated him, and Niki approved of him. That was the key, because I did a long interview with Daniel Bruhl about the role in Rush for the book. Bruhl said he was really, really nervous about taking on this role, because Daniel Bruhl's a German, Niki Lauda's an Austrian, and the two sides don't always like each other. And there's a big thing about getting the accent correct. And Bruhl he had a special dialect teacher who taught him how to do it properly in Austrian. And Niki said it was absolutely spot on. So in every aspect, Bruhl did a brilliant job. And when they went to the premiere, that's when Niki realized that people all around him were laughing, were crying, applauding it, and he suddenly thought, oh, it's not too bad after all. That's fine, and he was quite happy with it.
Do you ever sometimes think to yourself about how far that you've come? I know your dad introduced you to the sport, taking you to the Tourist Trophy. You get a chance to go to the 1951 British Grand Prix, and then just a few years later, you're going to the Monaco Grand Prix with friends, and then eventually writing a story about it as a spectator, and then kind of carving out your own career as a journalist, and basically, as we mentioned, kind of talking your way into the business and finally getting credentials to cover F1. I mean, what an incredible story. We could spend an hour just talking to you about your career.
When you're doing all these things that you've described at the time, you're so busy fighting to survive and to move on and to make it, and to make your name and to be established and to work for newspapers and be recognized, doing a good job for them. And then the next job you get, editing a Grand Prix annual or whatever it might be, doing a proper job. You're so focused on doing that and moving on and building your life and building your reputation that you don't have time to stop and think about what it is that you're in. I've had time to sit here in the office, and the Lauda book was a classic example. As I went through all my cuttings and pulled off the reports from the 70s and 80s and races I'd seen, I began to realize what I had seen. I began to realize what I have up here, these memories and so on. Behind me, I've got loads of pictures. I used to take a lot of pictures, just black and white pictures with Sure Shot camera in the 80s and 90s to illustrate a column that I wrote for a South African magazine. And I've realized now, looking at those, that the backdrop to the picture, the pit scene or the garage scene or whatever, the equipment they've got, how that's changed. But at the time, you don't notice it. You just think that's the way it is. But when you look back 20 years, you realize what you've lived through, the period you've lived through, how different everything was, how there were no motorhomes then, or there was, you could talk to drivers, like you could go up to them in the paddock, hello, how are you? Now you have to make an appointment for a 10-minute slot. It's just so different. So I've lived through that period, and I'm only beginning to appreciate it. If I'm honest, Bobby, I'm only going to appreciate it right now as I have time to sit back and relax. So I think the bottom line is I've been very lucky.
And you actually used to put your reports on a typewriter and then send them through the mailbox.
Yeah, we used to use a telex. Do you remember them with the big tape? It was a nightmare. You had to tap it out on a machine, and it was yards of tape, and that would be fed into a machine which would chatter out in the newspaper office at the other end. It was horrendous. Or you had to telephone your story through by phone from the noisy racetrack to the newspaper office, trying to shout each word over to them. That was a nightmare.
This is such an insightful and comprehensive book, and I hope the fans at home that have gotten a chance to hear you today go out and pick up a copy. They can get it through Amazon or Simon & Schuster UK. It's just a great book. I really appreciate you taking the time, Maurice.
Bobby, it's been my pleasure. Thank you very much for chatting. It's been a lot of fun talking to you. You clearly know your stuff. You've been doing your research. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Nice to meet you.
Thank you, Maurice.